Guardsman James Wilson had been standing at his post outside Windsor Castle for 2 hours and 13 minutes when he first heard the crying. The sound was faint at first, almost lost in the steady murmur of tourists and the distant hum of traffic on the busy road that ran past the castle grounds. But James had been trained to notice everything. The soft sobbing of a child was not something he could ignore. His position required absolute stillness, perfect posture, and complete focus on his duty. The Queen's Guard was not merely ceremonial. They were active soldiers responsible for the security of royal residences and the safety of the royal family. Breaking formation or abandoning his post was not just discouraged, it was forbidden under any circumstances except direct orders from a superior officer. James had served with the Coldstream Guards for 3 years, ever since joining the army at age 18. He had completed his basic training, excelled in ceremonial duties, and earned the respect of his commanding officers through dedication and unwavering discipline. Standing guard at Windsor Castle was considered an honor, a recognition of his professionalism and reliability. The red tunic he wore was pressed to perfection. The gold braiding gleamed in the afternoon sunlight, and his tall black bearskin hat sat precisely at the regulation angle. Every detail of his appearance met the exacting standards that had been maintained by the Queen's Guard for centuries. Tourists frequently stopped to take photographs with him, marveling at his statue-like stillness and military bearing. But now, as the crying continued, James found his concentration wavering from his ceremonial duties to the source of the distressing sound. Without moving his head or changing his rigid posture, he used his peripheral vision to scan the area around his post. The castle courtyard was busy with visitors, tour groups, and staff members going about their daily routines. Near the castle's main entrance, about 30 feet from James's position, he spotted the source of the crying. A little girl, perhaps 5 or 6 years old, stood alone beside a stone pillar. She wore a bright yellow dress and small white shoes, her dark hair tied in pigtails with colorful ribbons. Her face was red from crying, and she kept turning her head in different directions, as if searching for someone. James felt his heart sink as he realized the child was lost. The castle grounds were vast, with multiple entrances, gift shops, restaurants, and tour routes that could easily confuse young visitor. During busy periods like this, it wasn't uncommon for children to become separated from their parents or tour groups. But usually they were quickly reunited with adult supervision. This little girl, however, appeared to be completely alone. She had been crying for several minutes now, and no adult had approached her. The tourists walking nearby seemed too focused on their sightseeing to notice her distress. Or perhaps they assumed she was with someone who would return momentarily. James's training told him to maintain his position and alert security through proper channels. There were plainclothes security officers throughout the castle grounds, and his radio could summon assistance within minutes. The protocol was clear. Guards on ceremonial duty did not abandon their posts for any reason short of direct threats to royal safety. But as he watched the little girl's increasing panic, James found himself torn between duty and compassion. She was clearly frightened, probably couldn't speak much English based on what he could hear of her crying, and seemed to be getting more distressed with each passing minute. The longer she remained alone, the more likely she was to wander into restricted areas or potentially dangerous situations. The castle grounds, while generally safe, contained numerous hazards for an unaccompanied child. There were staircases, water features, and areas where construction work was ongoing. More concerning, the main road that ran past the castle carried heavy traffic, and a frightened child might try to cross it while looking for her parents. James had grown up as the eldest of 4 children in a working-class family in Manchester. He had spent countless hours looking after his younger siblings, including his sister Emma, who was about the same age as the lost girl he was now watching. The protective instincts that had been ingrained in him since childhood were warring with the military discipline that had been drilled into him during his years of service. The sound of the child's crying seemed to grow louder, though James knew it was probably just his increasing awareness of her distress. He could see that she was now moving away from the pillar, taking hesitant steps in different directions as she searched for familiar faces. Each step took her further from the main entrance where her parents would most likely return to look for her, a group of tourists approached James's position, speaking in what sounded like German. They pointed at him and began taking photographs, chatting excitedly about the famous Queen's Guard. Under normal circumstances, James would have felt pride in representing his regiment and his country, but now their presence only emphasized his immobility. While a child nearby needed help, the tourists moved on, but more visitors continued to stream through the castle grounds. The afternoon was warm and sunny, perfect weather for sightseeing, which meant the area would remain crowded for hours. In such conditions, the lost child could easily become overwhelmed and make dangerous decisions in her panic. James caught a glimpse of the little girl's face as she turned in his direction. Right. Her eyes were wide with fear, tears streaming down her cheeks. She seemed to be looking at him, perhaps wondering if the tall soldier in the bright red uniform might be able to help her. But James remained motionless, bound by centuries of tradition and military protocol that demanded absolute adherence to duty. The internal conflict was becoming almost unbearable. Every instinct James possessed told him to help the frightened child, but his training and oath as a guardsman demanded that he remain at his post. Breaking protocol would have serious consequences for his military career, potentially including disciplinary action, demotion, or even dismissal from the guards. Yet as he watched the little girl take another uncertain step away from safety, James realized that some decisions transcended rules and regulations. Sometimes the right thing to do was also the most difficult thing to do, especially when it meant choosing between duty to institution and duty to humanity. James Wilson made the decision that would change his life in the space of a heartbeat. As the little girl took another step toward the busy road, he broke the rigid posture he had maintained for over 2 hours and stepped forward from his ceremonial position. The movement sent ripples of surprise through the crowd of tourists nearby. Phones and cameras immediately turned toward him as visitors realized they were witnessing something unprecedented. The Queen's Guard never broke formation, never abandoned their posts, never interacted with the public, except in the most extreme circumstances. "Sweetheart," James called out gently, his voice carrying clearly across the courtyard as he approached the frightened child. "Are you lost?" The little girl looked up at him with tear-filled eyes, taking in his imposing red uniform and tall bearskin hat. Instead of being frightened by his appearance, she seemed relieved to have someone speaking to her. She nodded vigorously, wiping her nose with the back of her small hand. James knelt down to her level, making himself less intimidating despite his formal military attire. His training had included basic phrases in several languages for dealing with international visitors, and he could hear from her crying that she was speaking what sounded like Italian. "What's your name?" he asked softly, switching to the basic Italian he had learned during his service preparation. "Sophia the girl," replied between sniffles. "Ho per sola mamma." James understood enough to know she had lost her mother. His heart went out to her as he saw the genuine fear in her young face. She couldn't have been more than 6 years old, far too young to be wandering around a castle complex alone. "Going to be okay, Sophia," James said, mixing English and Italian words he hoped she would understand. "We're going to find your mama." The crowd of tourists had grown larger, with people stopping to watch the unusual scene of a Queen's Guard comforting a lost child. Phones were recording everything, and James was acutely aware that his actions were being documented from multiple angles. Whatever consequences he faced for breaking protocol would be amplified by the viral nature of social media. Sophia seemed to relax slightly at his gentle tone and kind eyes. She pointed toward the main castle entrance and said something in rapid Italian that James couldn't fully understand. But he gathered that she had been separated from her family somewhere near the gift shop. James activated his radio with one hand while keeping his attention focused on Sophia. "Control, this is Guardsman Wilson at Post 7. I have a lost child, approximately 6 years old, Italian-speaking, separated from her family, near the main entrance." The response crackled through his earpiece immediately. "Wilson, return to your post. Security will handle the situation." But James could see that Sophia was already calming down in his presence, and moving her to unfamiliar security personnel might cause her to panic again. Sometimes the rulebook had to take second place to human compassion. especially when dealing with a frightened child. Control, the child is responding well to my assistance. Request permission to escort her to the security office. Negative, Wilson. Return to post immediately. That's a direct order. James looked down at Sophia, who was now holding onto his red tunic with her small hands, clearly finding comfort in his presence. The direct order from his commanding officer was unmistakable, but abandoning this frightened child felt wrong in every way that mattered. Sophia, he said gently, would you like to come with me to find your mama? She nodded eagerly, and James made his second protocol-breaking decision of the day. He stood up, carefully lifting Sophia into his arms, and began walking toward the castle's security office. The crowd of tourists followed at a respectful distance, many still recording the unprecedented scene. Sophia rested her head against James's shoulder, her crying finally subsiding as she felt safe in the arms of the kind soldier. James could feel the weight of his decision with every step. He was not just breaking minor regulations, he was directly disobeying orders from his superior officer. While on duty at a royal residence, the walk to the security office felt longer than usual, with dozens of eyes following his every move. James kept his expression calm and professional, but inside he was calculating the potential consequences of his actions. Court-martial, demotion, dismissal from the guards, and the end of his military career were all distinct possibilities. At the security office, James was met by Sergeant Major Patricia Collins, whose stern expression made it clear that news of his protocol breach had already reached the chain of command. Guardsman Wilson, she said in a voice that could cut glass, you were ordered to return to your post. Yes, Sergeant Major, but this child needed immediate assistance, and she was responding positively to my help. Sergeant Major Collins studied James's face, then looked at Sophia, who was still clinging to his uniform and seemed much calmer than she had been when alone in the courtyard. The child's parents have been located, Collins announced. They're on their way here now. They were in the gift shop and became separated in the crowd. Relief flooded through James, both for Sophia's reunion with her family and for the confirmation that his instincts had been correct about where she had become lost. Within minutes, a frantic Italian couple rushed into the security office, their faces showing the desperate worry that every parent feels when their child goes missing. The woman, clearly Sophia's mother, burst into tears when she saw her daughter safe in James's arms. Sophia mia bambina, the mother cried, reaching for her daughter. Sophia practically leaped from James's arms into her mother's embrace, chattering rapidly in Italian about the kind soldier who had helped her. The father shook James's hand repeatedly, mixing Italian and broken English in his gratitude. Grazie, grazie mille, the father said, tears in his own eyes. Thank you, soldier. You saved our little girl. James felt a warmth in his chest that no military commendation had ever provided. Sophia turned back to him from her mother's arms and blew him a kiss, her earlier tears replaced by a bright smile, as the Italian family was escorted away for the completion of security procedures. James turned to face Sergeant Major Collins, prepared for the consequences of his actions. Guardsman Wilson, you directly disobeyed orders from your commanding officer, she said, her voice still stern but perhaps slightly softer than before. Yes, Sergeant Major. I accept full responsibility for my actions. You abandoned your ceremonial post during active duty hours? Yes, Sergeant Major. And you caused a significant disruption to normal castle operations? James straightened his shoulders. Yes, Sergeant Major, but I would make the same choice again if faced with similar circumstances. Sergeant Major Collins studied him for a long moment, her expression unreadable. James could hear activity in the hallway outside as word of the incident spread through the castle's security network. The following morning, James Wilson stood outside the office of Colonel Andrew Richardson, commanding officer of the Windsor Castle Guard Detail. His dress uniform was immaculate, his boots polished to mirror brightness, but his stomach churned with nervous anticipation. The events of the previous day had been reviewed by senior officers throughout the night, and now he would face the consequences of his decision to break protocol. Sergeant Major Collins had escorted him to the colonel's office. Her expression, remaining professionally neutral despite the gravity of the situation. James had barely slept, replaying the incident over and over in his mind. While he remained convinced that helping Sophia had been the right thing to do, he understood that military discipline required consequences for insubordination, regardless of the motivation. "Enter," came the colonel's voice from inside the office. James marched in with crisp military precision, stopping exactly 3 paces from the colonel's desk and snapping to attention. "Guardsman Wilson reporting as ordered, sir." Colonel Richardson was a veteran of 30 years' service, a man who had earned his rank through unwavering dedication to military discipline and royal protocol. His office walls were lined with commendations, photographs with members of the royal family, and symbols of a distinguished career built on following orders without question. "At ease, Guardsman Wilson," the colonel said, gesturing to a chair across from his desk. "Please, sit down." The informal tone surprised James. He had expected a formal disciplinary hearing with multiple officers present, not what appeared to be a private conversation. "Sir, I want to state for the record that I take full responsibility for my actions yesterday. I broke protocol, disobeyed direct orders, and abandoned my post. I understand the seriousness of these violations and accept whatever punishment you deem appropriate." Colonel Richardson leaned back in his chair, studying James with intelligent eyes that had seen decades of military service and human nature. "Guardsman Wilson, in 30 years of commanding soldiers, I've learned that the most interesting cases are rarely the ones that fit neatly into regulations and procedures. Your case is certainly interesting." James remained silent, unsure how to respond to such an unexpected opening. "Tell me, in your own words, what went through your mind when you decided to leave your post?" the colonel requested. "Sir, I saw a frightened child who needed help. She was alone, crying, and moving toward potentially dangerous areas. My training told me to follow protocol and call for security, but my conscience told me that a scared little girl needed immediate assistance. And when you received direct orders to return to your post." James took a deep breath. "Sir, I weighed my duty to follow orders against my duty to protect those who couldn't protect themselves. I chose to prioritize the safety and well-being of a vulnerable child over strict adherence to ceremonial protocol." Colonel Richardson nodded slowly. "I've reviewed the security footage of the incident, Guardsman Wilson. I've also reviewed your service record, which shows 3 years of exemplary performance with no previous disciplinary issues." James waited, knowing that his future in the military hung on the colonel's next words. "I've also received several phone calls this morning that I think you should know about," the colonel continued. "The first was from the Italian consul, expressing his government's gratitude for the compassionate treatment of Italian citizens visiting our country. This was unexpected." James had focused so much on the military consequences of his actions that he hadn't considered the potential diplomatic implications. "The second call was from the castle's public relations office. Apparently, videos of your interaction with the lost child have been viewed millions of times on social media platforms. The public response has been overwhelmingly positive, with people praising the humanity and kindness shown by the Queen's Guard." James felt a mixture of relief and continued apprehension. Positive public opinion might help his case, but military discipline operated independently of civilian sentiment. "The third call was the most interesting of all," Colonel Richardson said, pausing for dramatic effect. "It was from Buckingham Palace." James felt his heart skip a beat. Direct attention from the royal household was either very good news or very bad news with little middle ground. Her Majesty's private secretary wanted to personally convey the Queen's awareness of yesterday's incident. "It seems that Her Majesty was impressed by the compassion and good judgment shown by one of her guards in protecting a vulnerable child." The relief that washed over James was almost overwhelming. If the Queen herself had taken notice of his actions in a positive way, then his career might survive after all. "However," the colonel continued, his tone becoming more serious, "cannot ignore the fact that you disobeyed direct orders from a superior officer. Military discipline requires that there be consequences for such actions, regardless of the outcome or motivation." James straightened in his chair, prepared to accept whatever punishment was deemed appropriate. "Therefore, I am recommending that you be transferred from ceremonial duties to active security operations within the Royal Protection Detail. This represents a significant increase in responsibility and reflects confidence in your judgment and decision-making abilities." James could hardly believe what he was hearing. Instead of punishment, he was being offered a promotion to one of the most prestigious assignments in the British military. Sir, I don't understand. How is a promotion an appropriate consequence? For breaking protocol? Colonel Richardson smiled. The first time James had seen him show any emotion during the conversation. Guardsman Wilson, anyone can follow orders blindly. It takes a special kind of soldier to know when the spirit of duty is more important than the letter of regulations. The royal family needs protectors who can think for themselves, who can make difficult decisions under pressure, and who will prioritize human welfare over bureaucratic convenience. The colonel stood and walked to his office window, looking out at the castle courtyard where James had made his fateful decision the day before. Your actions yesterday demonstrated exactly the kind of judgment and character we look for in our most trusted personnel. You didn't break protocol to rebel against authority or to seek attention. You broke protocol to help someone who needed help, and you did it knowing there would be consequences. James remained seated, still processing the unexpected turn his disciplinary hearing had taken. The new assignment comes with additional training, increased security clearance, and significantly more responsibility. You'll be working directly with senior royal protection officers and may have contact with members of the royal family themselves. Are you interested in this opportunity? Yes, sir. KOTCO? Good. Your transfer will be effective next Monday. Mundret Major Collins will provide you with the details of your new duties and training schedule. James prepared to leave. Colonel Richardson had one final comment. Guardsman Wilson, what you did yesterday required courage. Not the courage to face enemy fire or complete dangerous missions, but the courage to do what's right when it's also difficult. That kind of courage is rare, and it's exactly what we need in the people who protect our most important institutions. Walking out of the colonel's office, James felt as though his entire world had shifted. What he had feared would be the end of his military career had instead become the beginning of an opportunity he had never imagined possible. 3 weeks into his new assignment with the Royal Protection Detail, James Wilson found himself in situations he could never have imagined during his ceremonial duties. His training had expanded to include advanced security protocols, threat assessment, emergency procedures, and the complex logistics of protecting members of the royal family during public engagements. The transition from standing motionless at a ceremonial post to actively participating in security operations had been challenging but rewarding. James worked alongside experienced protection officers who had dedicated their careers to royal security. Learning from veterans who had handled everything from routine, public appearances, to serious security threats, his new colleagues had welcomed him with a mixture of respect and curiosity. Word of his protocol-breaking rescue of little Sophia had spread throughout the royal protection community. Creating a reputation that preceded him into every new assignment, Wilson called Inspector David Matthews, the senior protection officer, who had become James's mentor. You're assigned to the Duchess of Cambridge's visit to the Children's Hospital today. Close protection, minimal profile. James felt a surge of nervous excitement. This would be his first assignment involving direct protection of a senior member of the royal family during a public engagement. The responsibility was enormous, but his training had prepared him for exactly these situations. The Children's Hospital in Central London was bustling with activity as staff prepared for the royal visit. James arrived 2 hours early as part of the advanced security team, working with local police and hospital security to ensure every aspect of the visit would proceed safely. His role was to remain close to the Duchess while maintaining an unobtrusive presence that wouldn't distract from her interactions with patients, families, and hospital staff. The challenge was to be ready for any potential threat while appearing relaxed and approachable. When the Duchess arrived, James was struck by her natural warmth and genuine interest in the people she met. She spent time with each child, listened to their stories, and showed the kind of compassion that couldn't be taught or faked. It reminded him of why he had been willing to risk his career to help a frightened little girl. Just weeks earlier, the visit was progressing smoothly until they reached the pediatric intensive care unit. Among the young patients was a 7-year-old boy named Michael, who had been seriously injured in a car accident. His parents sat beside his bed, Exhaustion and worry etched on their faces after days of maintaining a bedside vigil. When the Duchess approached Michael's bed, James noticed something that made his protective instincts activate. The boy's father, a man in his early 30s, was showing signs of severe stress that went beyond normal parental concern. His hands were shaking, he was sweating despite the cool hospital air, and his behavior suggested someone on the edge of emotional collapse. James positioned himself closer to the family, ready to intervene if the situation became problematic. His training had taught him to recognize signs of potential instability, and everything about the father's demeanor suggested someone who might react unpredictably under pressure. The Duchess was speaking softly to Michael, who was conscious but clearly very ill. She held his small hand and listened as his mother explained the severity of his injuries and the long recovery process ahead. The conversation was touching and deeply personal, exactly the kind of interaction that made royal visits meaningful. For families facing difficult circumstances, suddenly, Michael's father stood up abruptly, his chair scraping loudly against the hospital floor. His face was flushed, and James could see tears streaming down his cheeks as he struggled with overwhelming emotions. "This isn't right," the man said, his voice cracking with anguish. "Tonight, my boy might never walk again, and we're supposed to pretend. Everything's okay just because royalty comes to visit?" The room fell silent except for the soft beeping of medical equipment. Hospital staff froze, unsure how to handle the outburst. The Duchess remained calm, her expression showing understanding rather than offense at the father's emotional breakdown. James found himself facing another moment where protocol and human compassion collided. His training dictated that he should immediately remove the distraught father from the area to protect the Duchess from any potential threat. But his instincts told him that this man wasn't dangerous. He was simply a heartbroken parent, overwhelmed by circumstances beyond his control. Instead of restraining the father or calling for his removal, James stepped forward and placed a gentle hand on the man's shoulder. "Sir," James said quietly, "I can see how much you love your son. The Duchess can see it too. That's why she's here, because she cares about families like yours who are going through difficult times." The father looked at James with surprise, perhaps expecting to be removed or reprimanded for his outburst. Instead, he found understanding and compassion from the very person whose job was to protect against potential threats. "I just want my boy to be okay," the father whispered, his voice breaking completely. The Duchess, who had been watching the exchange, stepped closer to the family. "Of course you do.
Ow.
Any parent would feel exactly the same way. Your love for Michael is obvious, and that love is going to be crucial to his recovery." She spent the next 20 minutes with the family, listening to their fears and concerns, offering words of encouragement, and connecting them with resources that might help during Michael's long rehabilitation process. Her genuine care and attention transformed the father's anger and frustration into hope and gratitude. James remained close throughout the interaction, ready to protect the Duchess if necessary, but increasingly convinced that his role was more about facilitating meaningful connections than preventing problems. The protocol manuals had prepared him for physical threats and security breaches, but they hadn't addressed situations where compassion was more important than caution. After leaving Michael's room, the Duchess spoke privately with James in the hospital corridor. "Thank you for how you handled that situation," she said. "She could have had the father removed, but instead, you chose to help him feel heard and supported. Your Royal Highness, he wasn't a threat. He was just a scared parent who needed understanding." The Duchess smiled, a genuine expression of approval. "That's exactly the kind of judgment we need from our protection officers. Anyone can remove a perceived problem, but it takes wisdom to know when compassion is more appropriate than force." Remainder of the hospital visit proceeded without incident, but James knew that his approach to the distraught father had been noticed by everyone present. His willingness to prioritize human dignity over rigid security protocols had once again put him in a position where his actions would be evaluated by superiors. On the drive back to the palace, Inspector Matthews sat beside James in the security vehicle, his expression thoughtful. "Wilson, that was either very smart or very risky what you did back there," Matthews said. "Probably both." Sir, the situation didn't warrant aggressive intervention. Father needed support, not restraint. I agree with your assessment. But not everyone will see it that way. Some will argue that you put the Duchess at risk by not immediately removing a potentially unstable individual. James understood the complexity of his position. Royal protection required constant balance between security and accessibility, between caution and compassion. His decisions would always be scrutinized and second-guessed by those who prioritized different aspects of the job. However, Matthews continued, the Duchess specifically requested that you be assigned to her future hospital visits. She was impressed by your ability to read situations and respond appropriately. Once again, James found that his willingness to follow his conscience, rather than strict protocol, had led to unexpected opportunities rather than punishment. 6 months after his first assignment with the Duchess of Cambridge, James Wilson had established himself as one of the most trusted members of the Royal Protection Detail. His ability to balance security requirements with human compassion had earned him respect from colleagues and appreciation from the royal family members he protected. However, its reputation for bending rules when circumstances warranted, it was about to face its most serious test yet. James was assigned to a high-profile state dinner at Buckingham Palace, where security protocols were at their most stringent, and any deviation from established procedures could have international consequences. The event was honoring a visiting head of state from a country with complex political relationships with Britain. Security arrangements had been planned for months, involving multiple agencies, extensive background checks, and carefully choreographed procedures that left no room for improvisation or personal judgment. James's role was to monitor the palace's east entrance, where service staff and approved contractors would be entering throughout the evening. His position required him to verify credentials, coordinate with security checkpoints, and ensure that no unauthorized personnel gained access to areas where world leaders would be present. The evening began smoothly, with catering staff, musicians, and technical personnel arriving as scheduled. Each person had been extensively vetted, their credentials verified multiple times, and their presence accounted for in the detailed security planning. James checked identification, confirmed arrival times, and maintained communication with the Central Security Coordination Center around 7 o'clock. As the formal dinner was beginning in the palace's grand ballroom, James noticed an elderly woman approaching his checkpoint. She wore the uniform of the catering company contracted for the event, but something about her seemed unusual. Her movements were hesitant. She appeared confused about the entrance procedures, and she didn't have the confident demeanor typical of staff who regularly worked palace events. "Good evening," James said as she approached his security station. "May I see your identification and work authorization?" The woman fumbled through her purse with shaking hands, clearly nervous about the security procedures. When she handed him her documents, James immediately noticed discrepancies. Her catering company identification card had today's date, suggesting she was a temporary employee hired specifically for this event. More concerning, her hands showed signs of medical tremors, and her confusion seemed to go beyond normal nervousness. "Ma'am, are you feeling all right?" James asked, concerned about her obvious distress. "I'm sorry," she replied in a voice that carried a slight accent. "This is my first time working at the palace. I was hired just yesterday to replace someone who became ill. I'm afraid I'm quite overwhelmed by all the security procedures." James's training immediately flagged several red flags. Last-minute personnel changes, especially for high-security events, were highly unusual and potentially dangerous. The woman's confusion and trembling could indicate medical issues that might affect her ability to work safely around world leaders. Most seriously, her late hiring meant she had received minimal background screening compared to regular palace staff, according to strict security protocols. James should have immediately denied her entry and contacted his supervisors for guidance. The potential risk of allowing an inadequately screened individual into a state dinner was enormous, and any security breach could have career-ending consequences for everyone involved. But as James studied the woman more carefully, he saw something that gave him pause. In her purse, visible when she had searched for her identification, was a small photograph of a young girl who appeared to be around 10 years old. The woman's worn clothing and anxious demeanor suggested someone facing financial difficulties, possibly someone who desperately needed the temporary work to support her family. "Ma'am, what's your name?" James asked gently. "Lena Petrov," she replied. "I immigrated here from Eastern Europe 5 years ago. Worked several jobs to support my granddaughter since my daughter died. The catering company called yesterday and offered me work for tonight. I need the money, but I'm so nervous about making a mistake." James felt his heart sink as he recognized the impossible position he was in. Alina appeared to be a genuine catering employee who needed work to support her family. But her late hiring and obvious nervousness made her a potential security risk that he couldn't ignore. His radio crackled with routine security updates as the state dinner continued inside the palace. World leaders were dining together, discussing matters of international importance, completely dependent on security personnel like James to ensure their safety. "Mrs. Petrov, I need you to wait here for a moment while I verify your employment status," James said, reaching for his radio to contact his supervisors. Elena's face fell as she realized there might be problems with her documentation. "Please." "Sir, I promise I'm not causing trouble. I just need to work tonight to pay my granddaughter's school fees. I've worked for this catering company before, just not at such an important place." James hesitated with his finger on the radio button. Calling his supervisors would likely result in Alina being denied entry and losing the income she desperately needed. It would also create a minor disruption in the evening's carefully planned logistics. But failing to report potential security concerns could have much more serious consequences. "Mrs. Petrov, tell me about your granddaughter," James said, making a decision that once again put human compassion ahead of rigid protocol. Elena's face brightened immediately as she showed him the photograph from her purse. "Her name is Anna. She's 10 years old and the smartest girl in her class. But the private school she attends costs more money than I usually make, and I couldn't afford this month's fees. When the catering company offered me extra work, I said yes, even though I was scared to work at the palace." James looked at the photograph of a smiling young girl who reminded him of his own sister at that age. Elena's story seemed genuine. Her motivation for working the event was understandable, and her nervous behavior was consistent with someone in her circumstances rather than someone with malicious intentions. But more importantly, James realized, he had the authority to make a judgment call based on his assessment of the situation. His training had taught him to evaluate threats and respond appropriately, and everything about Alina suggested she posed no danger to anyone. "Mrs. Petrov, I'm going to personally escort you to the catering supervisor so you can begin your work," James announced, making another decision that prioritized human dignity over bureaucratic convenience. "Really? You're not going to turn me away?" "Oh, ma'am. But I am going to stay in contact with your supervisor throughout the evening to ensure everything goes smoothly." The relief on Elena's face was immediate and profound. Tears formed in her eyes as she thanked James repeatedly in both English and what he assumed was her native language. James escorted Alina through the palace corridors to the catering preparation area, where he spoke privately with the head supervisor, Maria Santos, who had worked palace events for over 15 years. "Maria, this is Lena Petrov, the temporary employee hired to replace the staff member who became ill. She's nervous about working her first palace event, so I wanted to personally introduce her to you." Maria looked at Alina with understanding. Sympathy. "Don't worry, dear. Palace events can be intimidating, but we'll take good care of you. We'll make sure you're assigned to kitchen duties rather than serving, so you won't have to worry about interacting with the guests." As James prepared to return to his post, Alina grabbed his arm gently. "Double quotes, sir. I don't know how to thank you. Could have sent me away, but instead you helped me. My granddaughter will be able to stay in her school because of your kindness. Just do your best work tonight, Mrs. Petrov. That's all the thanks I need." James returned to his security checkpoint, where the evening continued without incident. Alina worked quietly in the kitchen, helping with food preparation and cleanup under Maria's supervision. Several times throughout the night, James checked in with the catering supervisor to ensure everything was proceeding normally. "Your lady is working out wonderfully," Maria reported during one of his checks. "She's hardworking, respectful, and follows instructions perfectly. Could use more temporary staff like her." The state dinner concluded successfully at 11 o'clock, with world leaders departing after productive discussions and ceremonial exchanges. The security operation had functioned flawlessly, no incidents or threats to mar the international gathering, as palace staff began the cleanup process. James helped coordinate the orderly departure of temporary workers and contractors. When Alina approached his checkpoint to leave, she was carrying a small envelope that she pressed into his hands. T***. This is a letter from my granddaughter Anna, Alina explained. I told her about the kind soldier who helped her grandmother tonight. She wanted to thank you too. James opened the envelope to find a hand-drawn picture of a palace guard helping an elderly woman, along with a note written in careful child's handwriting. Thank you for helping my grandma. You are a hero. The simple gesture moved James more than any official commendation he had ever received. Anna's drawing would become one of his most treasured possessions, a reminder of why compassion and human dignity should never be sacrificed for bureaucratic convenience. 3 days later, James was once again called to Colonel Richardson's office, but this time he approached the meeting with confidence rather than anxiety. His track record of making difficult decisions that balanced security requirements with human needs had established him as a trusted member of the protection detail. Guardsman Wilson, the colonel began, I've received reports about your handling of a potential security issue during the recent state dinner. Yes, sir. I made a judgment call about a temporary catering employee who appeared nervous but posed no actual threat. The head of Palace Catering specifically mentioned your professionalism and good judgment in managing the situation. She was impressed by your ability to balance security concerns with operational needs. James felt relief mixed with pride. Once again, his willingness to trust his instincts and prioritize human welfare had been vindicated by the positive outcomes. There's something else, Colonel Richardson continued. Majesty has specifically requested that you be assigned to her personal protection detail for upcoming engagements. It seems your reputation for combining security expertise with human compassion has reached the highest levels. The news was stunning. Assignment to the Queen's personal detail was the pinnacle of achievement for any protection officer, representing ultimate trust and responsibility. Sir, I'm honored by Her Majesty's confidence. I won't disappoint her. I'm sure you won't, Wilson. Your ability to make the right decisions in difficult circumstances is exactly what we need in our most sensitive positions. As James left the colonel's office, he reflected on the journey that had brought him from ceremonial guard to the Queen's protection detail. Each decision to follow his heart rather than rigid protocols had opened new opportunities and earned greater trust from his superiors. The path had not always been safe or predictable, but it had led to a career built on principles that mattered more than regulations: compassion, integrity, and the understanding that true service sometimes required courage to do what was right rather than what was merely prescribed. 2 years after his first protocol-breaking decision to help little Sophia, James Wilson stood in the private gardens of Buckingham Palace, wearing the distinctive uniform of the Queen's personal protection detail. The journey from ceremonial guard to one of the most trusted security officers in the royal household had been extraordinary, built on moments when he chose compassion over rigid adherence to rules. On this particular morning, James was accompanying Her Majesty during her daily walk through the palace gardens, a routine that required both vigilance and discretion. The Queen valued these quiet moments away from official duties, and her protection officers understood that their role was to ensure her safety while preserving the peaceful nature of her private time. As they walked along the familiar paths lined with roses and carefully manicured hedges, James noticed the Queen pausing more frequently than usual, her steps slightly slower than normal. At 96 years old, Her Majesty still maintained a remarkable schedule of official duties, but James had learned to recognize signs when she might need additional support. Your Majesty, would you like to rest on the garden bench for a few minutes? James suggested gently. The Queen smiled at his thoughtfulness. That would be lovely, James. Sometimes these old legs need a moment to catch up with my intentions. As they settled on a marble bench overlooking the palace's famous rose garden, the Queen surprised James with an unexpected conversation. James, do you remember the first time we met?
Yeah.
You had just been assigned to my detail, and you looked absolutely terrified." James laughed, recalling his nervousness during those early days. "I was terrified, Your Majesty." "The responsibility felt overwhelming, but you adapted quickly. Your colleagues speak very highly of your judgment and your ability to balance security requirements with human dignity." The comment reminded James of the path that had brought him to this position. From his decision to help Sophia to his support of Alina, Petrov, and countless other moments when he had chosen empathy over rigid protocol. "Ma'am, I've learned that the best security comes from understanding people rather than just following procedures." The Queen nodded approvingly. "That's exactly why I requested you for my personal detail. Too many people in positions of authority forget that rules should serve humanity, not the other way around." Their conversation was interrupted by the sound of children's voices coming from the direction of the palace's main entrance. James immediately activated his earpiece to inquire about the unexpected noise, but the Queen placed a gentle hand on his arm. "Wait, James. Let's see what this is about before we assume it's a problem." Through the garden gates, they could see a group of school children on what appeared to be an educational tour of the palace grounds. Children, perhaps 8 or 9 years old, were clearly excited to be at Buckingham Palace, though their voices carried a tone of disappointment. James could hear fragments of conversation from their teacher. "I'm sorry, children, but the private gardens are not part of our tour. We can only view them from outside the gates." One little girl pressed her face against the wrought iron gates, trying to get a better look at the famous rose garden. "But Miss Johnson, those are the most beautiful flowers I've ever seen. I wish my mom could see them." The Queen looked at James with an expression he had learned to recognize over their 2 years of working together. It was the same look she got when she was about to make a decision that might surprise her security detail, but would undoubtedly be the right thing to do. "James, those children have traveled quite far to visit the palace, haven't they?" "Yes." "Ma'am, based on their accents on the school bus I saw earlier, I believe they're from a Northern England school. Probably a once-in-a-lifetime trip for most of them." The Queen stood up slowly, smoothing her practical dress and adjusting her ever-present handbag. "Then perhaps we should give them a memory they'll treasure forever." James understood immediately. What she was suggesting, his security training, automatically calculated the risks and complications of such a spontaneous decision. Allowing unscheduled public access to the private gardens would require additional security clearances, coordination with multiple departments, and significant deviation from established protocols. But James had learned that the most meaningful moments often came from the most unexpected decisions. His reputation had been built on knowing when to bend rules for the greater good, and he recognized that the Queen was presenting him with another such moment. "Ma'am, if you're certain about this, I can coordinate with palace security to arrange a brief, supervised visit for the children." The Queen's face lit up with the same joy James had seen countless times when she interacted with young people during official engagements. "Please do, James, and let's make it special for them." Within 10 minutes, James had coordinated with palace security, the children's teacher, and the tour guide to arrange an impromptu visit to the private gardens. The group of 30 children was escorted through the gates with barely contained excitement, their eyes wide with wonder at the unexpected opportunity. What happened next would become one of James's most cherished memories from his service with the royal household. The Queen spent nearly an hour with the children, showing them different varieties of roses, explaining the history of the gardens, and listening to their questions and observations with genuine interest and delight. She posed for photographs with each child, signed autographs, and even picked a small bouquet of flowers for their teacher to take back to their school. The children were enchanted by her warmth and accessibility, seeing Her Majesty not as a distant figure from their textbooks, but as a kind grandmother who was genuinely interested in their lives and experiences. "Ma'am," one little boy asked with innocent curiosity, "do you really live in this big house all by yourself?" The Queen laughed, a sound of pure joy that echoed through the garden. "Well, I have quite a few helpers, including this nice young man here," she said, gesturing to James. "He makes sure I don't get into too much trouble during my garden walks." As the impromptu visit concluded and the children prepared to leave, their teacher approached the Queen with tears in her eyes. Your Majesty, you've given these children an experience they'll remember for the rest of their lives. Many of them come from families who struggle financially, and this trip to London was a major expense for our small school. What you've done today has made it all worthwhile. The Queen smiled warmly. The pleasure has been entirely mine. These children remind me why we do what we do. After the school group departed, James and the Queen resumed their walk through the gardens. The spontaneous interaction with the children had energized Her Majesty, and she seemed to walk with renewed vigor. James, thank you for making that possible so quickly and safely. Thank you for thinking of it, ma'am. Those children will never forget today. The Queen paused beside her favorite rose bush, one that had been planted to commemorate a particularly meaningful royal visit decades earlier. You know, James, when I was crowned 70 years ago, I promised to serve my people with my whole heart. But over the decades, I've learned that the best service often comes in the smallest moments, like helping a lost child find her parents or giving school children an unexpected memory. James understood that she was referring to the incident that had started his journey from ceremonial guard to trusted protector. His willingness to break protocol to help Sophia had set in motion a series of events that had fundamentally changed his life and career. Ma'am, I've learned that the most important rules are the ones written in our hearts rather than in procedure manuals. The Queen nodded approvingly. Exactly, James. Rules and protocols are important, but they should never prevent us from showing kindness when kindness is needed. As they completed their garden walk and returned to the palace, James reflected on the extraordinary journey that had brought him to this moment. From a young guardsman terrified of breaking protocol to a trusted member of the Queen's personal staff, his career had been defined by moments when he chose to follow his conscience rather than rigid procedures. The little girl from Italy, distraught father at the hospital, the elderly catering worker, and now a group of excited school children. Each interaction had reinforced his belief that true service meant putting human dignity above bureaucratic convenience. Walking beside the Queen through the corridors of Buckingham Palace, James understood that his willingness to break protocol when compassion demanded it had not only saved his career, but it also enabled him to serve at the highest levels of one of the world's most respected institutions. His story had become an example throughout the royal protection services of how good judgment, human empathy, and moral courage could be more valuable than blind adherence to rules. Young officers now learned about the guardsman who had risked his career to help a lost child and had been rewarded with the Queen's trust and confidence. The question that had haunted James 2 years earlier, whether he was right to follow his heart rather than protocol, had been answered definitively. Sometimes the most important duty is the duty to remain human. Even when wearing a uniform that represents centuries of tradition and rigid discipline,